on what's beginning to look more and more like a winter evening. But here we are, not having to go anywhere except sit in front of the screen. So we're looking at the moral values of religions and public life this evening. And I suppose we could say that humankind has always had a sense of the other or the sacred, however imagined. And deep in the human consciousness, there is an awareness of the transcendence. It is part of being human. Humankind has always been, it seems, in search of meaning and for moral values that give meaning and a basis for a good life together. Houston Smith has put it this way: wherever people live, whenever they live, they find themselves faced with three inescapable problems: how to win food and shelter from their natural environment, the problem nature poses; how to get along with one another, the social problem; and how to relate themselves to the total scheme of things, the religious problem. The total scheme of things includes the ultimate questions within the ultimate mystery. The human searches for meaning and values, and does so especially in the face of crises and suffering. There was always something more, an ideal, a better self, a better community, and there was the something more. And then in our human history, humankind took a massive leap forward. Consciousness was raised to a whole new level and to a greater depth of meaning and being and existence. It was not just local, but a global leap. Unknown to each region, the great leap in spiritual consciousness happened across the planet. It was later named as the Axial Age. So let's look at that for a while. Karen Armstrong has described it as the Great Transformation, a phenomenal period in human history when there was an explosion of new religious and philosophical ideas. Now understood and seen as the time of birth of classical religions and philosophical ways of life, they were born and they transformed our imagination and our understanding of what it means to be human. An integral part of that was transformation of how we imagined and understood the sacred and the spiritual. The human and the sacred are inseparable. It was a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, who called this pivotal age in human spiritual development the Axial Age. Karen Armstrong describes it this way: from about 900 to 300 BCE, or in four distinct regions, the great world traditions that have continued to nourish humanity came into being. Confucianism and Taoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, ethical monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. This was the period of the Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Amos, Jeremiah, the mystics of the Upanishads, Mencius and Euripides. During this period of intense creativity, spiritual and philosophical geniuses pioneered an entirely new kind of human experience. There is perhaps no other age like this in recorded human history. It changed everything. And whatever about the first human moon landing being what they called then a giant step for mankind, the years between 900 and 300 BCE were a giant spiritual, psychological, philosophical, intellectual, and religious leap for humankind globally. Something was born in those centuries which is still part of who we are, still in our DNA, and until another huge leap in consciousness happens on the planet, we are the living heirs of this human spiritual leap. Christianity and Islam came much later and could not have come into existence without the human spiritual transformation of the Axial Age. Armstrong again. Rabbinic Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were all latter-day flowerings of the original axial age. Now, this is not to take away from the uniqueness that adherents of these flowerings may wish to claim, but it is to recognize that each is rooted in the age that pushed the spiritual human frontiers, which brought to life a dimension of transcendence at the core of being human. Christianity and Islam as Abrahamic faiths should have no difficulty in recognizing how much they owe to Amos, Jeremiah, and the Hebrew prophets. They are, after all, prophetic religions. Armstrong has helped to identify the core characteristics of this remarkable era in human consciousness. There was and is a transcendent dimension to being human. It was not that all the great imaginations and minds of then saw this as supernatural. Confucius played down the supernatural, and many others refused to talk about it. There was a transcendent dimension, though. Life was not only material, but also deeply spiritual. The experience of a something more was inexpressible and ineffable. How could you really talk about ultimate reality? There was a mysticism about the axial age, and many of the great minds and imaginations were mystics. The axial age put morality at the heart of all life. Life had moral meaning. There was an essential goodness to be experienced and practiced. Ethics and the spiritual belonged together. The important thing was not belief, but behavior. Pre-axial age, there was a great deal of ritual as a way of participating in what was sensed to be the sacred. Now there was transformation at a deeper level. There were still rituals necessary to humans, but now ethics were at the heart of being spiritual. The transcendent, the sacred, the something more was experienced through living compassionately. Religion, says Armstrong, was compassion. The axial age was an age of much suffering and violence, though. The great personalities were not armchair philosophers or theologians. They lived through intense suffering and violence. The faiths and systems that developed at this time all shared, in Armstrong's words, an ideal of sympathy, respect, and universal concern. There was nothing narrow or tribal about the compassionate spirituality of the age. Universal concern was core practice. The age produced the golden rule, found now in every world religion in various forms. This was empathetic spirituality. It included leaving behind greed, egotism, hatred, and violence. Transcendence included rising above these negative and destructive values to the higher values of compassion and universal concern. As the wisdom teachers of the axial age saw it, we are to engage with self-criticism. Not enough to blame and scapegoat the other or each other. But being human means examining ourselves first, looking into our own greed and violence and violent behavior. And then there is practical, effective action. Life is not living with dogma, doctrine, or philosophical foundations, but action, practice, reflection, transformation, and practice again. A key insight from the age that speaks powerfully into the COVID-19 crisis has been put this way. It is to face up to the suffering that is an inescapable fact of human life. Much of suffering we cannot explain or understand. We can make no sense of it. But the response to suffering does not lie in explanations, but in compassionate response. We can, of course, evade suffering, pretending it is nothing to do with us, or go into denial. The defense mechanisms are very often taking refuge in alcohol or drugs, narcoticizing the feelings, overeating, consumerism, possessions, money, or indeed forms of escapist religion, where God becomes a great soother, and religion is a self-interest practice, and prayer becomes lost in individualistic and privatized piety. We will exclude or try to exclude the pain and suffering of others except our own. As Armstrong put it, people who deny the suffering of life and stick their heads ostrich-like in the sand are false prophets. Unless we allow the sorrow that presses in on all sides to invade our consciousness, we cannot begin our spiritual quest. Suffering will sooner or later impinge upon all our lives, even in the protected societies of the first world. There is no such thing as an individual self, and the axial age has helped us to see this. A me world may be prevalent, though COVID-19 may be changing that. There have been many signs that I is becoming we, as we recover the practice of being a compassionate, caring community. In doing so, we are becoming a moral community. Truly human society is impossible in a world of I's. The axial age put the morality of compassion and love at the heart of the truly human life. And that meant life together, in solidarity, with universal concern and practical support to the neighbour. Love and concern are not only moral values which challenge all self-interest and short-sighted social, economic, and political policies. It is the way to transcendence and the way to know the transcendent. Now we can unmute and maybe a couple of quick comments or questions of clarification, and then Loretto will allocate us to our various rooms with a question which will come up on the bottom of the screen.
Johnson, who was the guy Armstrong you mentioned?
Karen Armstrong.
Karen?
Karen Armstrong, and her book, from which some or maybe most of the quotes were coming, is The Great Transformation.
Sorry, The Great?
Transformation.
Yep.
Okay, shall we?
Johnston, how do you spell axial?
A-X-I-A-L.
I-X-I-A-L.
A-X-I-A-L, yeah.
A-X-I-A-L.
I suppose that the philosopher who used the word was maybe saying it in sense of it was a big hinge moment in our human history when something turned. And the remarkable thing about it was, I suppose, it was happening across the globe pretty much around the same time, in an era when we certainly did not have the communications we have now, and yet it was happening in China, India, Middle East, Greece.
Johnson, where would you put Abraham in terms of his era in connection with those spiritualities?
Well, Abraham, the historical Abraham, insofar as we can know anything about the historical Abraham, probably is just about inside that, or on the edge of it. But the Abraham that we encounter, I think, in the Hebrew Bible is a text that is being written and reflected on much, much later, and would be coming from within, certainly would be coming from within that axial edge. If much of our Hebrew Bible now, as we have it, was edited and created and, to use a computer term, cut and pasted, it happened in the 6th century in the
history
Babylonian
evolved. As their history evolved. But would you say Abraham's Babylonian roots would have been part of?
Well, I think from 800 to 600, as we'll see a little later, you have the era of the great Jewish prophets, the great Hebrew prophets. Amos, the first probably of the written prophets, through to people like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, in 6th century. And that's the great era and the great contribution of Judaism to this axial age. That's when a very real ethical, I think it seems to me, a very real ethical monotheism, if you like, was being shaped and expressed. Now, if we can imagine it this way, I think it's looking back through the lens of the Babylonian experience and the trauma of that, and the new insights that began to emerge, and the prophetic tradition. It's looking back through that the Jewish people put together the Torah and write up the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. But in a sense, it's being seen through the lens of a later time. And we're not, therefore, and it doesn't matter. It's not a question really about the absolute historicity of it. It's being reflected.
There was definitely an apparent move from many gods to God Most High within the Hebrew mindset.
There was something of a move. Israel, it's hard to pin that one down. Ancient Israel did move somewhere, but for a lot of what we even have in the Hebrew Bible, it's not an absolute belief in one God. There is the acknowledgement very often that there are other beings and other whatever out there, but that Israel is to worship the one God.
Yes.
And I think that's more the emphasis. But then that was being, prophets were putting that into a very ethical context.
Good.
In terms, just the period, it's talking about Israel, though. I'm not sure if this is helpful or not, but a lot of the prophets came along when Israel was messing up. A lot of their teaching was against things that, idolatry in particular. Unfortunately, the prophets were, when things were going well, was there a prophetic voice? I just wonder.
Well, I think you're right.
Maybe going off on a tangent here, but I just wonder about that.
I think you're right that the prophets emerged. The prophets emerged when elites were going off the rails. The idolatry was very often. Well, the idolatry was very often tied into social and economic systems, was expressed through social and economic systems. And the prophets come along, I think, with a social critique, but not just quite a devastating and robust social critique of what's going on at the top, if you like. But they come along with a radical alternative that is rooted in the values of covenant and Sinai. In a sense, that's what radical is. Radical is going back to roots. But they were going back to roots at a time when there was a moral decadence, a social moral decadence, and a lot of social injustice. Micah, for example, when the elite in around the capital were fleecing and exploiting the rural poor, and that's what he's sounding off against frequently in the book that we call Micah. So there is a contestedness running through the Hebrew Bible as we have it, and the contest, if you like, is between what we might call royal theology on the one hand and prophetic theology on the other. And the royal theology was the theology of the center, the theology of the status quo, the theology of the establishment, the monarchy, Solomon and his empire of terrible exploitation economically, political corruption, and religion dragged in to justify it all. And on the other hand, you have the prophetic tradition, which then raises these big ethical questions about this injustice and immorality of social systems and power. But the two are in tension, running all the way through the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Okay. I will say, jumping to the New Testament, a lot of, particularly what Paul wrote, was to correct stuff that was wrong, that was going on at the time. Would that be true?
I think Paul is struggling to establish faith communities and strengthen faith communities in local contexts. Yeah. And I think we have not recognized for a very long time, but have in the last, I think, 30 years or so, begun to realize that a lot of what Paul is critiquing and opposing is the Roman imperial system that is so prevalent all throughout the world in which he lives and works. The big empire is there, the big superpower is there, with its economic oppression, with its military might, with its political systems of power and domination. And Paul is frequently, and I think one of the things we realized was I've come to realize, Paul is using vocabulary in his letters that is very often Roman imperial vocabulary, and he's using it quite intentionally, and he's using it to subvert.
Paul was a Roman citizen, so he probably knew how the system worked.
Well, he knew the system, yeah, and he was opposed to it, and part of the corrective, I think, of biblical insight and Christian Testament scholarship in the last number of decades has been to recognize that this is what Paul was doing, when very often for some centuries we thought Paul was being anti-Jewish. And we set up a whole supersessionist thing that Christianity had superseded Judaism and was superior to Judaism. Now we've realized that what Paul was opposing was not Judaism, because not only was he a Roman citizen, he kept saying again and again in his letters he was a Jew. And it's not anti-Jewish that Paul is being. It's anti-imperialism, anti-Roman, anti-domination system. That's what makes him so radical, I think.
Johnston, can I take you back a few minutes there ago? You were talking about how the people of Israel had a choice of which God to worship.
Yeah.
Among a number of gods. Can I just check with you, do you mean that their choice was to worship Yahweh, the one true God, the Most High, or is it your position that they could have worshipped other gods?
It did.
I don't think any of us can deny that there's other spiritual beings, and it's certainly a very biblical principle to believe that. But surely as Christians, our position should be that there actually is one true God.
Well, there are two things. There are a lot of parts of the Hebrew Bible when there is a struggle and a tension going on between the worship of many gods and other gods. And there is a sense for much of the Hebrew Bible that they didn't deny that possibility. But the prophets were calling them to a much more refined image or vision of God, who was ethical, and therefore that had implications for life. For example, when we see a choice between worshipping the god Baal or worshipping Yahweh, that is not just a metaphysical argument about a Baal and a Yahweh. It is in fact choosing between two competing, contrasted and contested social economic systems. Baal was associated with systems of exploitation and domination. Ancient Israel and the prophets were saying Yahweh is associated with the ethics of justice and compassion and love and shalom. Choose that rather than Baal. So the choice was not just where you tipped your hat on the Sabbath day or on festivals. The choice was about a way of living, to live within oppressive systems or to live within systems that are much more just and compassionate.
I would agree with that. I mean, clearly we would all like to make the good choices. The issue is it your position that Yahweh has a different position from Baal, or is it your position that all of them were equal choices that the people could have made?
I don't think it's a case of whether they're all equal choices or not. I think it's a case very often in the Hebrew Bible, you choose the domination system, you choose the system that's unjust, you choose the system that exploits and the gods that are associated with that, or you choose Yahweh, which is the choice for justice and compassion and solidarity and peace and non-violence. That's the choice. And that's why Micah can say, we will follow the Lord our God, Yahweh, because the choice is for a higher and more ethical way of living. Again, we must not, I think, reduce belief in God to a kind of theological system kind of belief. In the Bible, this is much more profound and much more challenging than that. It's a choice between systems of life and ways of governance and ways of constructing community. Are we for justice or are we for injustice? That's the difference in believing in Baal and believing in Yahweh.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Loretto, can we go to rooms and take 20 minutes? Can everyone hear me? Do I need to unmute?
Yes.
Not sure.
Yes,
Yeah,
I can hear.
We can hear.
Okay, great. I hope you had a good discussion and a good lively discussion. What are the things that are significant in the axial, and what are the key insights? What significance do they have for us? Any pearls of wisdom from any group?
I think our group kind of got caught up in the whole idea of social justice.
Okay.
And maybe touch slightly on how that is interpreted.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it is in many places contested. How people interpret that are differently. You're quite right, Paul. Your group was quite right in that. Northern Ireland, I mean, we have, to put it maybe oversimply, we have two traditions, if you like, and I'm generalizing now, but they're very often two different ideas of what justice is and social justice is. You get the same in Israel-Palestine. You get the same in most conflict regions, I think. Those in power, those who hold power, usually see justice as law and order. And those who are the oppressed or the discriminated against or the second-class citizens or whatever, usually see justice in terms of fairness and equality.
Yeah, hi, it's Clive.
Hi, Clive, how you doing?
we had a fairly lively discussion as well about your question there, and also we went on to America and the current elections and Trump and everything else. But one of the things that I think Richard said towards the very end really was that it's far too easy for Christians to think that we have a compassionate, caring God and other people don't, other religions don't. So I suppose that is sort of really comes back, to the actual, the actual age is why do we've inherited our religion through the Jewish tradition, and is it why do the Jewish people and following on the Christian people and maybe the Muslims as well now think that our God is compassionate and caring, but other religions, such as I suppose Buddhism and Zennism and Confucianism and all the rest of it, they we don't consider their gods to be compassionate. And that was, I thought that was that's probably where we kind of fail, really. I think to be inclusive with all other world religions.
Yeah, I suppose there's a tendency in every religion to think that it's got the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Therefore, we have the monopoly on something like compassion or justice. But the point of the axial age was that many of these classical religions were born in that age, including Judaism. And they're all born with the golden rule at the heart of it. They're all born with compassion at the heart of them.
Yeah.
So it's universal concern, I think, were the words we used at one stage.
Yeah.
Not confined to any one tribe or one group or one institution. Maybe we've been taught differently. That's the problem.
Yeah, because I think at somewhere towards the start, you mentioned about rather than sort of religion sort of being sort of tied up with sort of dogma, it's really it's action that it's action that is needed, that is more important.
Yeah. And the axial age, I think, was about action, about doing, about behavior.
But this is still needed, though.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I do think that, okay, the idea of what you believe, the dogma, whatever, theology, whatever you want to call it, is important. That's the skeleton. I suppose it is the acting out of that belief and how you behave to others. That's the muscle. Without muscles, the skeleton just sits there and it rattles. Without the skeleton, the muscles don't do anything. But it's both together, I guess.
Well, is it maybe two-way, Paul?
Yeah.
Without the doing,
there's too much skeleton in our belief, maybe.
Our theology, our best theology emerges from action. Any others?
Well, maybe the validity of our theology would be tested by the action. Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
Right. Well,
I think, Johnston, in our group, we were also just beginning to get into a discussion that runs through charitable discussions as well, and that is, what is the nature of the action? Is it about helping people out or helping people up out of the position that they've found themselves in? And in other words, how much is the action about some sort of fight back or rebalancing of injustices, as opposed to the provision of food, or as well as the provision of food, or whatever it might be for. So we were just beginning to get into a discussion about that. What is the nature of social justice and the actions that need to be taken, and how far should they go.
Right, thanks, Jacqueline. That's quite a discussion, because I suppose what you're asking really is what's the difference between charity and justice? And it seems to me that the prophets were for social justice and a radically alternative form of justice that would make a difference to the way in which society was structured, and a difference to the policies and practices that pulled and held society together. They were as well as critiquing and deconstructing. I think they were also constructing and taking the action to construct a common good.
It's very interesting because in the history of voluntary action, you also find that schism between those organizations or activism that says that the task is really about helping people out, whether that's on a peer basis or in a support basis, and the school of thought that says, well, really it's about educating people to help themselves out of the position they find themselves in, and so that side of it becomes caught up in discussions about other forms of justice, which are access to power, access to decision making, and so on. So it's interesting that debate runs across that axial discussion that you're referring to, but you can find it all the way through the seeds of the various types of organizations that developed as a voluntary response to social injustice over many years.
Yeah, and I think we need to go on living with those tensions and those discourses. Thank you. Can we? There's more, I'm sure. Let's take we maybe need a little break at this stage. Let's take 10 minutes break. Make yourself coffee or tea or well, if anything else, don't tell us. It seems.
Absolutely.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Are we all back, I suppose?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here.
I think we are. Okay. Want to take a little while now to look at Judaism in the Axial Age and briefly at Islam as a flowering or extension of that age. Judaism, as we already saw, was born in the Axial Age and with the other classical religions and philosophies of life that came along at that same time. Now, the Torah, all important to Jewish people, a way of life or program for living in community, is at the heart of the Jewish tradition. And underpinning the Torah are the insights and critical wisdom of those Hebrew prophets. They were the great Jewish voices of the Axial Age, and their voices, awareness of the spiritual and ethics for shared life, are profound. The two largest religions on the planet currently, Christianity and Islam, cannot be understood without the prophets. In the words of Houston Smith, it is to a remarkable group of men whom we call the prophets more than to many others that Western civilization owes its convictions. One, that the future of any people depends in large part on the justice of its social order. And two, that individuals are responsible for the social structures of their society as well as for their direct personal dealings. Now, like the other sages of the Axial Age, the writing prophets of ancient Israel also lived in violent times where there were serious inequalities, privileged elites, and widespread injustices. And their concern was for the marginalized and the exploited, the abused, very often the unwanted children, the social suffering at the heart of their society, which undoubtedly resulted in psychological and physical suffering, the sick body politic, and the moral delinquency that pervaded so much of social and political life. Between 800 and 600 BCE, these prophets burst into the life of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, with a fundamental principle that rings across the centuries down to our 21st century. In Smith's words again, the prerequisite of political stability is social justice, for it is in the nature of things that injustice will not endure. Stated theologically, the point reads, God has high standards, divinity will not put up forever with exploitation, corruption, and mediocrity. Well, this did not contradict the prophet's emphasis on the love and compassion of God, which they affirmed strongly as love and compassion for the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and those oppressed by the injustice of social policies and systems. We live in a moral world, and the prophets were putting morality at the heart of social and spiritual life. Again, in the words of Houston Smith, the prophets of Israel and Judah are one of the most amazing groups of individuals in all history. In the midst of the moral desert in which they found themselves, they spoke words the world has never been able to forget. Bursting into the 8th century BCE were Amos, Isaiah of Jerusalem, Hosea, and Micah. Amos was a farmer from Judah who found himself across the border in the northern kingdom of Israel. Told in no uncertain terms to go home by one of the professional prophets from the palace, the status quo guild, Amos stood his ground and demolished religious ritual and practice that ignored the social inequalities and substituted religious ritual and high-performance liturgy for social justice. His still memorable words ring out across the centuries. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Isaiah of Jerusalem was a palace prophet, a status quo person, who was overwhelmed in the temple itself by an experience of God's otherness and holiness. The experience empowered him to become a critic of the social and economic policies of the system and of the violence that underpinned so much of community life. And his experience of divine holiness translated into a vision of social solidarity and justice for those excluded by the elite. Hosea had a very fragile and bad marriage experience through which he learned something of the fidelity and persistence of the love at the heart of the sacred. Now, it has to be said that women in particular have times huge difficulty with some of Hosea's metaphors, and they do need to be questioned. Yet the solidarity and love that he was discovering at the heart of the universe was bound up with the suffering of humanity and the earth, and was a love that would never, ever let go or give up. Hosea also offered the most devastating critique in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament of policies and practice of violence, and of the mystique of violence, so much a part of his society. He relentlessly spelt out the destructiveness of violence at every level of society and for nature. Micah was another rural prophet who was deeply pained by the unjust economic policies of his time and the impact those policies had on the rural poor. He also exposed the elaborate ritual of sacrifice and liturgy as devoid of moral values and practice. He articulated the high watermark of biblical social ethics, the benchmark, in fact, of public ethics for Jesus, for Paul, and for all religious ethics since. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require or ask of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? The practice of justice or tenacious solidarity, which is compassion, and humility in relation to whoever your God may be. Micah had already imagined a great parade for peace of all the peoples of the world, turning their weapons of destruction into implements of farming and produce, enabling enough for all and a common good. And the depth of universal concern expressed a remarkable vision of ecumenism. Micah 4 and verse 5, for all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God. But we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. You follow your God, and we will follow ours, and live together in peace and well-being. 2 centuries later, another great prophet of the axial age emerged in a period of catastrophe and crisis. The world of geopolitics changed as the Babylonian Empire replaced the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah was literally caught in the middle of this power struggle, and the suffering was intense and it was traumatic. Babylonian armies rolled over the region on the way to power and domination. And the first wave was in 597 BCE, and thousands of Jews were deported to Babylonian exile. A second wave of Babylonian military might swept over the region a decade later in 587, brutally slaughtering any who stood in the way and deporting thousands more. But thousands of poor were left in the rubble and ruins of a devastated city. And we encounter their very raw cries of lament in a book like Lamentations. Everything was destroyed in this political, social, spiritual, and existential crisis. The Babylonians had not only crushed the life of a people, they had crushed and destroyed their sense of God. God was dead. Jeremiah is a prophet of this era. He was not deported, but he did have to flee for his life to Egypt. He strongly opposed, the sense of exceptionalism and inviolability of temple and city that was so prevalent as the Babylonian threat gathered. The community leaders, political and religious, believed they had God on their side, God our help in ages past, and nothing would happen to them. And they proclaimed peace. For Jeremiah, this was dangerous nonsense. I suppose it is unfortunate that Jeremiah has come down to us as a kind of byword for pessimism and negativity. We talk about a Jeremiad. But as Karen Armstrong points out, he was right. His unflinching and courageous stand expressed one of the essential principles of the axial age. People must see things as they really are. They could not function spiritually or practically if they buried their heads in the sand and refused to face the truth, however painful and frightening this might be. I think we can say that there are truths and reality to be faced in the COVID-19 crisis. Jeremiah spoke in hope of a new covenant, a new moral community, and practical neighbourly concern. It would be Torah, a new programme for life, of just, compassionate neighbourliness. And as Armstrong puts it, if they could come through this time of trial, they would develop a more interior spirituality. The importance of interior spirituality, rather than external, structured and organized and formal, was a very profound insight of the Axial Age. And finally, to look at Islam in the Axial tradition. Islam was born into a violent society in the 7th century CE. It was a society where values were breaking down and economic injustice was rife. Muhammad was deeply troubled by this, and he spent a lot of time in moral reflection, very often in the desert. He received enlightenment, revelations, the 1st and 610 CE. And these became what we now know as the Quran, the sacred Muslim writings. The Prophet asked followers to prostrate themselves several times a day. In Armstrong's words, the posture of their bodies was designed to teach them at a deeper level than the rational what Islam required: transcendence of the ego, which prances, preens, and postures and continually draws attention to itself. There was a requirement also to give a proportion of income to the poor, known as zakat, a purification. An early description of the religion of Muhammad was sadaqah, which suggests that Muslims were to cloak themselves in the virtues of compassion and generosity. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is an ethical religion. And all three are profound ethical religions, and the Quran has social ethics. Three of them are worth highlighting quickly. First, community, or as Muslims call it, ummah, U-M-M-A-H. This underlines the importance and significance of community, and that members have moral obligations to the community as a whole. In Surah or chapter 9, verse 71, both women and men share in this moral responsibility. Second, Quranic ethics is justice-based. Again and again, the just treatment of all in the community and of all creatures is emphasized. This is justice towards the disadvantaged in society, classified then as women, orphans, and slaves. Justice is to be practiced before one's own interests, and administering justice is a fundamental, irreducible obligation of Quranic social ethics. And third, essential human equality before God. All humans are to have the same opportunity to realize their moral and spiritual potential. And this is more than spiritual equality. The Quran is also social and material in its ethics. In the Quran, orphans who were low status in pre-Islamic Mecca are presented as individuals with rights that must be protected. There is a duty of care and proper treatment of orphans and the vulnerable in society. And however spiritual the emphasis, social responsibility is never lost sight of. It is the spiritual. So the religions are wisdom traditions. And alongside these traditions are the great philosophical and humanist traditions. They are deep resources for justice and compassion. There is the golden rule common to all. They are all about relationality, community, social responsibility, and the common good. The interior spirituality, social justice, and practical compassion that burst into the world between 900 and 300 BCE, flowered in Christianity and Islam. There are no simple answers in a tragic and suffering world, but there is an interior spirituality of compassion and justice at the heart, and I think we can find it at the heart of all our wisdom and religious traditions. Okay, we can unmute, we can prepare to go to our rooms or groups again. And there is a question that is on your screen. What are the great contributions of Judaism to the Axial Age? So take 15 minutes at this, and then we'll come back about a quarter to, and we'll have the last 10 or 15 minutes for an open conversation. Thank you. Welcome back. Hope you had a good, lively discussion where you were with your group. Maybe you did stay with a question and identified some of the contribution of Judaism to the Axial Age, or maybe you even got on to the contribution of Islam to the Axial tradition, or maybe questions different altogether. But let's continue the conversation. Anybody want to kick off?
We suggested that the Judaism has contributed in terms of giving us a sense of community, a sense of justice, our moral obligation to act upon that, and a sense of human equality before God, and a duty of care to both the poor, the marginalised, the vulnerable in society, and indeed to the environment, and also to the attention to order and law in terms of, looking at Moses and the 10 Commandments. And we wondered how we sort of consolidate all of this into our society and politics of today.
Thank you, Grace. That was quite a discussion, and well summarised, I thought. I'm sure that any others? Come back to some of this. How do we implement this, build this into contemporary society and politics? Good question as well.
Yeah, we were reflecting, Johnston, that while the prophets kept going back to the law to say this is the fair play, equality and whatnot, you're not implementing that in terms of challenging the powers that be in their age. And point of interest was what you mentioned about in Islam and other religions, the question, is there the same strong prophets that were challenging the inequalities in their day? And also the fact that so much of in Christianity, we've been in bed with the status quo, and we have been, if you like, the royal prophets speaking peace, peace, when there is no peace and there's injustice, and we've gone with it. And now in a post-Christendom age, has the church hasn't any voice to speak with. So how relevant are we now to speak to the world about injustices? So there's a number of things in that, in terms of other religions, that they had their prophets that spoke out against their powers that be. Is that right, Johnston?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, Muhammad is a classic example. It's often forgotten that in Islam, the roots of origins of Islam are in the challenge to gross and rife social injustices.
Would that be evident within Hinduism or Confucianism or Buddhism?
Yeah, they if you take the Confucian tradition, it was very much an ethical tradition that was related to political systems and structures.
Okay.
An ethical tradition that had justice at the heart of it. And Confucius was actually a failed politician.
Okay.
Became an educator and set about educating for a well-constructed, just, humane, compassionate society. That's not to say that there were not blind spots and weaknesses.
Okay. Yeah.
There were. I mean, Confucianism has been heavily criticized for its attitude and practice towards women.
Okay.
And so too might Christianity be criticized for the same particular blind spot.
Yeah. So the question is, how relevant is the church to speak out today?
Yeah. Thanks for reminding of that question again. Your group did pose that question. Yeah, at the end of what you said. So, has the church any voice now worth listening to? Is anybody interested?
Or is it other verses in the secular world pointing out the inequalities of black rights and racism being listened to rather than the church saying anything about it?
Well,
does it depend what you consider the church to be?
Yeah.
You know,
I think some of the
maybe is those voices.
Sorry, we had a couple of voices there. I rather lost it, but could we if we didn't mind one at a time? I don't know who got in first, but I didn't recognize the voice either.
Yeah, I think
Paul,
some of the harshest critics of the whole Black Lives Matter thing, whether it's a movement or whatever, some people think that there are very sinister forces behind it. But the greatest critics of that I've heard have actually been Christians. Because a lot of them would say it's powered by atheists, communists, socialists, the great socialist bogeyman or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There are faith voices there, yeah. In a sense, always have been. I think sometimes when we look at the peace process, the long peace process that we've had in Ireland. I don't know how far back you want to go with the peace process, but it's not been the institutional forms of religion that have been in the front line. It has very often been individuals from those faith traditions who've had to almost step outside their institutions to be the peace builders and the peacemakers. And you may find something like that happening also within the Black Lives Movement and other big social movements.
Yeah, and some of the biggest criticizers of the peace process have been Christians too.
That's
so
right.
You're getting people on both.
Yeah.
Well,
the outside world is scratching its head and wonder what on earth is going on.
Yeah. Well, shorthand again, you get the clash between royal theology and prophetic theology. It's still there. It's not just back then in the Bible. It's a clash between status quo theology and a more critical prophetic theology. still runs through our society, I think.
Which side are we on?
Yes, Johnston, it's Clive again. Well, in answer to the what are the contribution of Judaism to the actual age, the very first thing I wrote down was very much in terms of social justice, and so that was explored quite a bit there about, and then one of the questions following on from that was, do we as Christians care for other groups of people? Or how do we care for other groups of people? And I think that maybe, as Paul was saying there about the Black Lives Matter and about about slavery, and I noticed I saw something on the TV recently about somebody in Arizona was taking up arms to keep out the Mexican refugees from crossing the border. I mean, with the intention of shooting them by the look of it. So it was. I mean, but do we as Christians, are any Christian groups sort of standing up against that? It's it seems that we seem to sort of we don't seem to speak out as a faith group. We don't seem to speak out against social injustice, and and I think we have a moral obligation to do that. Following on from our roots in Judaism, and and their sort of there's obviously a great there's that we talk about the attention to civil order and administration, which is fine. We've got through the Judaism we know we've got the 10 Commandments, but I mean how do we live these out though in the world? It's just this, I think we need to be enlightened. And someone mentioned there about, I think it was Richard mentioned about to be enlightened, to be led by the Spirit, sort of to be, was it revelationary? I think was a word. I don't know if Richard, was that a word that Richard used? I don't know, got it written, that the Jewish tradition gives us the order, but it's justice for everybody, which I don't seem to think that perhaps we as Christians sort of practice that.
Mm-hmm. So, there's also a question, I suppose. The practice of social justice, let's use that term for the moment, is that exclusively something that Christians do on their own, or Muslims do on their own? Or do we live in a different kind of world now, a very pluralistic world, where we've got to root our social justice practice in collaboration and partnership, and it's not just the faith dimension, it's the secular dimension as well, and the human dimension.
Yes, I think it involves people of all faith persuasions working together, because we're living in a more pluralistic world.
Yeah, it certainly is more pluralistic, and there's no evading that, I think.
Yeah, I think as Christians we need to grow out of this attitude that it's only Christians who do good things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think we can, and I think we go back to that remarkable vision of Micah.
Yes.
That I described it as a rather remarkable form of ecumenism. Certainly goes away beyond anything that as churches we've ever called ecumenism. walk in the name of your God, we'll walk in the name of our God, and we'll walk the road to peace, justice, and well-being.
Maybe any effect we're going to have isn't going to come directly from the churches. Maybe we need to go outside and join a political party.
Oh, here, that's a good idea.
The tribal political parties, is that what you're talking about?
Well, depends what you mean by tribal, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or the work of Amnesty International.
I think our problem living in an individualistic society, being now confronted with the pluralism of the world on the news and everything, I think we need to rediscover community again, as you were saying, Johnston. If that's part of the ideology of Islam, in terms of one of the three standard things to recognize and respect community, is that something we have to reconsider ourselves as a Christian community?
We are communitarian in a way. I think the individualistic thing has been a European Enlightenment movement. It's been. I mean, there have been lots of good things about the Enlightenment, but I think individualism, the individualistic, has plagued us.
It has.
And I think the biggest society, seems to me, in the world today in terms of individualism, the practice of individualism, is the US.
Yeah.
And there is this ummah that the Muslims talk about, this sense of community and the sense of moral and social responsibility within community and for each other. We'll come back to something of this in about 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
When we look at a covenanted society.
Yeah.
But we've gone to 9 o'clock, and I think here's something worth thinking about on the way. I'm going to say on the way home, but everybody's already home. The Dalai Lama talks about 2 pillars for secular ethics. Ethics beyond religion, if you like. And in some way, this also comes out of the axial tradition. And those 2 pillars, the first is the recognition, he says, of our shared humanity. And the second is the understanding of interdependence as a key feature of human reality. So the recognition of our shared humanity and the understanding of interdependence as a key feature of human reality. He sees that as twin pillars of secular ethics. Well, anyway, look, we've got to 9 o'clock. We don't have all the answers. We never have. No one has. But thank you for participating this evening in the way that you did. There did seem to be some very lively discussions going on there. Probably part of the problem is we don't have enough time to be in group discussion, maybe. But we'll need to look at that. But next week, we'll look at an inclusive moral community when we are taking a critical look at the Sermon on the Mount and justice for all. So that's next week's theme. So in the week that lies between, stay safe and keep well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johnston.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Johnston.
You too. Good night. Good night, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye then.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, Johnson. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Loretto.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you, Loretta. Yeah.
Loretta, thank you.
Good night.